Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It looks like this court is going to put the onus on Congress or on state legislatures to make explicit what is already implicit in the First and Second and Fourth Amendments, just to name a few, which is that, in fact, the Constitution does apply in cyberspace. I'm old enough to remember law school, and my lefty professors would say, like, look, the Constitution has to follow the flag. Otherwise, you can have backdoor tyranny, kind of authoritarianism flowing in, and pointing to places like the Philippines or whatever, where America got into the colonialism business. And at the time, it seemed a little quaint. There was some consternation over Iraq and all that. But those chickens have very much come home to roost. We need federal legislation, state level legislation, making clear that we are all willing to take the risk of actually remaining the United States of America in the digital age, although it may be inconvenient or slightly more arduous path than that taken by great collectivist regimes elsewhere. End rant.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host for today, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. I'm joined by editor James Poulos and Spencer Clavin, special editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. Well, today, which is Wednesday, the Supreme Court came down with a decision regarding a long-awaited First Amendment-related case. Murthy versus Missouri was originally brought by attorneys general from Louisiana and Missouri, and then joined by other interested parties against the Biden administration. Following the release of the Twitter files, it emerged that the Biden White House had engaged in a long process of communication with social media companies regarding what they considered controversial content. The federal government, it appeared, had asked the tech companies effectively to throttle or censor its opponents on a variety of issues. The origins of COVID, the effectiveness of masking and lockdowns, the validity of the 2020 election, statements that Hunter Biden's laptop was really his. The administration's minions would send, many times a day, emails back and forth with people at Twitter, Facebook, etc., asking them to, remove this post or, throttle this content or keep this under wraps. Could you block this person? Lower courts found for the plaintiffs, ruling that the White House had engaged in an egregious pattern of suppression of free speech. But today, the Supreme Court dismissed the case on the basis that the plaintiffs had no standing. Amy Coney Barrett wrote for the majority. She was joined by the three liberal justices and then Chief Justice Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. She wrote, "To establish standing, the plaintiffs must demonstrate a substantial risk that in the near future they will suffer an injury that is traceable to a government defendant and redressable by the injunction they speak. Because no plaintiff has carried that burden, none has standing to seek a preliminary injunction." Samuel Alito wrote the dissent, joined by Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch. Alito wrote that the court permits the successful campaign of coercion in this case to stand as an attractive model for future officials who want to control what the people say, hear, and think. That is regrettable. Now, it's true that we, I think I speak for all of us on this team, and, I think a lot of people we're looking forward to a different conclusion in this case, one that would preserve the opportunity for free speech on any platform and restrict the government from pressuring private companies to censor information that they found objectionable. What do you guys think? I imagine you must have some opinions on this.
Yeah, I think that the governing elite has already given up on the American people and given up on the Constitution in light of the way that the digital technologies they created have proceeded to sweep around the world and be taken up by alternative regimes, regimes that are not delicate about how they make their choices, regimes that have been pretty patient in suffering their way through the late 20th century and into the early 21st, and now really have no sympathy for the predicaments that America has stumbled into. And the reaction of the governing elite has been to say, like, well, we don't have the luxury of being the America of yore anymore. We have to become this new digitized thing, and that means that the Constitution stops at tech's edge, and the American people are just going to have to eat their vegetables, or else the bad guys win. That seems to be the consensus view. It keeps popping up in the way that courts make their decisions, in the way that the legislature sits on its hands, in the way that the executive aggressively moved under Obama into consolidating the tech industry in the hands of a few mega corporations, and then under Biden has used it as a tool of trying to create a new body politic and really just breaking up and suppressing and oppressing the old body politic. It's all very unfortunate. The worst news, to add insult to injury, is this case that went up was not a great case to hang our digital futures on. It did have problems. It was all too easy for the court to sort of cherry pick those problems and slap it down on that basis. The conservative movement is really far behind the left when it comes to anything resembling, lawfare or, kind of working the courts, working the refs. Federalist Society just hasn't been enough. That's a misfortune in its own right. So, we're in hot water. There's still some runway left, to mix metaphors a little bit. We do still have some time, but it looks like this court is going to put the onus on Congress or on state legislatures to make explicit what is already implicit in the First and Second and Fourth Amendments, just to name a few, which is that, in fact, the Constitution does apply in cyberspace. I'm old enough to remember law school, and my lefty professors would say, like, look, the Constitution has to follow the flag. Otherwise, you can have backdoor tyranny, kind of authoritarianism flowing in, and pointing to, places like the Philippines or whatever, where America got into the colonialism business. And at the time, it seemed a little quaint. There was some consternation over Iraq and all that. But those chickens have very much come home to roost. We need federal legislation, state level legislation, making clear that we are all willing to take the risk of actually remaining the United States of America in the digital age, although it may be inconvenient or a slightly more arduous path than that taken by great collectivist regimes elsewhere. And rant.
Well, I just think it shows that this illegitimate right-wing Supreme Court is in the pocket of Donald Trump and the interests that he represents. From a 5,000-foot level, I actually think it's helpful to have a decision to point to in a recent spate of decisions that puts the lie to that really ridiculous accusation against this court and against the court generally. I think, as James indicated, the justices in this case were not, pitched a solid fastball down the middle that they could knock out of the park. They were given something with all sorts of structural problems. And contrary to what you may have heard after the Dobbs decision and other related decisions, they're not actually just interested in ruling for the sake of whatever outcome they desire. These are highly textualist and procedurally oriented justices that care very much about the limits of their responsibilities, what they can and can't do, for exactly the reasons that James is indicating about the sort of larger questions about who rules. What is the document? What is the set of ideas? What is the set of laws that rules the land? And these justices have one set of things that they can and can't do within that set of one set of things that they can and can't do within that structure, and some things that they can't. And it's a failure of the right and of those everywhere who believe in things like First Amendment free speech that we didn't offer up something meatier that they could bite into here while still retaining that role. So that's thing one. Thing two, of course, which is much more urgent, and whatever route we take to kind of address this issue, this is the issue that needs addressed, is the one that James is talking about, which is, are we doing American politics or not? I mean, Vivek Murthy, the defendant in this case, is the same guy who wants to make gun violence into a public health crisis and therefore absent also the Second Amendment from what we would think of as politics. The point of all this stuff, the point of talking about this in terms of its risk to public health or to some larger abstraction, is to remove it from the sphere where Americans can have an influence over what they are guaranteed in the Constitution, can protect the rights that they're guaranteed in the Constitution. And there's an interesting, I think, parallel going on between the way that our bureaucrats treat questions of public health, which increasingly expands to touch any number of issues of vital importance to our Americans' daily lives, and matters of cybersecurity and the internet. In both cases, their immediate impulse is to say that this is just an exception where, sorry guys, we tried really hard to do the America thing, but circumstances beyond our control have rendered it impossible, and so you're just going to have to take several seats. And that's not an acceptable answer. Ultimately, it's a whole mode of thought that Americans are going to have to refute through all three branches of their government. All three branches of government, wherever we have influence over them, should be clawing back this mode of thought that is basically inherently not only anti-American but anti-politics. Full stop.
Yeah, that's a great point. The thing about this, now I remember we talked about this on the podcast maybe, 2 years ago. And I remember saying, well, even if the Supreme Court rules our way, I mean, will that really make a difference? There's all kinds of ways that the government can express dissatisfaction or, indicate its preferences regarding. Look at the way the press is controlled. Is it a violation of the First Amendment when, Karine Jean-Pierre or whoever in that department takes aside a few key reporters and asks them to, stress a certain angle, or, gives them a wink and a nod about some issue, and it's understood how things are supposed to be portrayed. I just always wondered, well, how would we really? That's why it's like a small c constitutional issue where we really need a regime change rather than try to tinker with the rules of communication between the government and Twitter or Facebook. Because so the Supreme Court says, okay, you can't tell them what to do. Well, all right. I'm sure there must be a million ways to work around that. Now I have a couple questions. One, well, basically, so some people are saying, well, this just means that Congress has to do something now. I guess that's my main question. I had another one, but it slipped my mind. So, is that possible? Are we going to see Congress try to step in and micromanage these relations, or what? What's the next step?
Unlikely. It's just not likely. They've to their minds, I think they've got bigger fish to fry. I think there's a lot of panic over what's going on with China barely under the surface. Republicans in Congress have to come to some sort of consensus about how they're going to just make it through the day, starting with this presidential debate, I guess, is going to officially kick off the real honest to goodness general election season. Whether there's going to be a real honest to goodness general election remains to be seen, but the Congress critters can't be feeling very chill right now, and there's probably a handful of them who would even be willing and able to lash together the kind of bill that we would want to see. So maybe one of those guys, and to be a little less of a pessimist about it, even just one of those guys putting together the legislation. It's not going to be a phone book. It's going to look a lot more like, I think, the language of a constitutional amendment than it'll look like, the Affordable Care Act or whatever. That could be enough to begin a domino effect. There are states, a growing list of states, who are taking the kind of approach to digital rights that is needed. A lot of those states are coming at it from the standpoint of Bitcoin, which is important. And if one brave member of Congress managed to put forward a bill and present it and frame it in the right kind of way, I think it would make a difference. And I think it would, this is something that can be coordinated with the Trump campaign. Like, there are ways, you guys, of seizing the moment, as dark as the moment may be.
Yeah. James, I think it was you on another episode who made the point that, like, we talk all the time about having a government of laws and not of men as this American ideal, but that even when you think about what that means, there are ultimately people who enact those laws, and people have philosophies and attitudes. And if their philosophy is inherently antithetical to the office in which they find themselves or the restrictions placed upon it by the Constitution, then they have a million ways of getting around those restrictions, undermining the nature of their role, going beyond it, and so forth. And I think this speaks to what Seth is asking about, the kind of who will rid me of this meddlesome priest nature of so many of these cases. I mean, this one is kind of the classic example that you don't have to say, please silence Americans. You just have to have some press conference where you're like, I wish somebody would do this, or some email to Zuck where you're like, it sure would be great if we could, like, tamp down these FBI threats or whatever. And in the end, yes, you have to put your people in charge, and those people then have to write laws, perhaps even pass a constitutional amendment. But it does also, I think, speak to, like, clearing house and winning elections, because these are the people who are gonna, if they don't philosophically believe in the spirit of the laws, then, like, the letter of the law isn't gonna hold them back. And the problem here is the same one we had with COVID, where you're having, on the one hand, these arguments about, well, how should, we shouldn't do that to preserve our American civil liberties, and maybe we should walk these restrictions back. And you don't realize that on the other end of that conversation is somebody that doesn't even flatly does not believe in civil liberties, like, and has been saying so philosophically since, like, the capital P progressive era, right? That the Constitution is the sort of outdated living document, and history has moved us beyond Republican government. And in the COVID era, we sort of saw this opportunity for that mask to fall off. And so, like, you can and should be making these changes through the system, but you also just have to, like, get rid of in government the people who, whatever they may say, just, like, don't believe the system is actually right or virtuous or good or safe or whatever.
I'm wondering, I remembered the question I had. What does the left say about this ruling? I haven't really seen anything yet.
I think it's a challenge to them because of what I said earlier on, that like this court is supposed to be evil Trumpist, Handmaid's Tale oppressors. And now they have to sort of pause. I don't know. I haven't seen that much of it either, but I think it's a problem.
Right. And they're all supposed to be pro-free speech. So you'd think that they would, assuming they have principles, would be opposed to it. But I just haven't seen anything yet. James, have you heard of any leftists opining on this?
I think they kind of learned their lesson on all these kinds of civil liberties issues. Just don't bother speaking up. I think they really got, just the wind knocked out of them with the assimilation of the Bernie Sanders wing back into the corporate Borg. Why bother? Because that's just what Trump wants you to do, is to try to defend your civil liberties. So I don't think we're going to hear much. No, maybe from a few of the diehard dissenters on the left, like Glenn Greenwald and those guys, but probably not much.
Yeah, I'm looking at Lawrence Tribe's Twitter feed right now, and he's talking a lot about the Supreme Court, but it's all about some other case that was decided, the Snyder. I'm not even sure what that case is. He just totally ignores the Murthy case.
Also, like, free speech as a principle on the left, much like civil liberties generally, is sort of a quaint notion at this point, probably for the reasons James just adumbrated, right? That it was a matter of like high philosophical principle for the real and serious left, and that has totally gotten assimilated into the yes but left, where it's like, yeah, we're the ACLU, but if it's a white nationalist Nazi, like probably not total freedom of speech. I'm just looking at The Guardian, and it says U.S. Supreme Court allows government to request removal of misinformation on social media. So they're framing it in the typical way that they frame exceptions, quote unquote, exceptions to free speech, which is like, if it's bad speech, like, well, of course, we don't. Yeah,
I think I saw a few years ago the ACLU put out an official statement saying that we're no longer really concerned with the First Amendment. That's not our focus anymore.
Well, they definitely had an internal document after, I think it was Charlottesville, where they were like, before you take up a case, just consider, like, think about whether you might be helping white nationalists, basically.
Yeah. Well, in related news, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, was freed from prison in Britain yesterday. Assange has had a difficult decade or two. In 2010, WikiLeaks released several major tranches of classified military and diplomatic files and cables related to the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and other things too. The U.S. began investigating Assange on hacking and espionage charges. Right around this time, Sweden issued warrants for his arrest for sexual assault charges, which he ducked. And then he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he lived for 7 years. Then they withdrew asylum, and he was put in a British prison for 5 years. He served a short prison term, I guess, for bail jumping. And then he was fighting extradition to the United States to face trial for espionage. So he was locked up in Belmarsh prison, apparently under pretty harsh conditions. It sort of seemed, everybody kind of assumed he was going to die, like be Epsteined or something. But this week, he struck a deal with the U.S. government to plead guilty to one charge of violating the Espionage Act. He flew to the Northern Mariana Islands, like some of our outlying territories, for some kind of jurisdictional purpose that's obscure to me. He didn't want to set foot in the United States proper. He attended a federal hearing. He was convicted of his one charge, released, given time served in a British prison which doesn't make sense to me, and then flew home to Australia. I don't know. You know what? The whole case always struck me as weird. I never really knew what to make of it. It seems strange that the government would go after a journalist for publishing stuff, but then I guess, well, was he working with like Chelsea Bradley Manning or the other people who were spies like Edward Snowden? You know, to me, it seems like, well, in those cases, yeah, like Edward Snowden, I don't understand why people think Edward Snowden was a hero. I mean, wasn't he just like, I mean, he was a CIA guy and he released the secrets. I mean, his job is to maintain the secrets. Like Chelsea Manning, same thing. Assange is a different, has a different role. Anyway, what do you guys think? How does this all shake out to you? James, I know you had some interesting, sort of conspiracy tinged thoughts about the Assange deal, but.
Well, right. So there are these rumors that WikiLeaks has deleted a bunch of like DNC emails or files, creating maybe an appearance of like there was some kind of quid pro quo going on. I mean, it is strange, to say the least, that Assange would be freed by the Biden administration with basically no fanfare, no comment, really. Almost like a Friday night news dump, but of a person who, any way you slice it, is and has been definitely involved in spy games of a very high order. All of these guys, every single one of these whistleblowers or WikiLeaks people or whatever, like this is all part of the cyber war that has been unfolding for a long time. And, we kind of experienced some of the second order effects of this. And it's in the nature of that war that, sometimes things that are bad for the national security state turn out to be good for the American people. And the awkwardness of that and the insanity of that is something that has been haunting the United States of America for a long time, certainly since the Patriot Act, and things have only gotten worse from there. And this is probably just going to be one of those unsolved mysteries. I can't imagine that they would have let him go without extracting some kind of agreement or neutralizing some aspect of the WikiLeaks organization. Maybe they just bought him off. Who knows? We don't get to know. And that's politics in 2024. And it just sucks. It's demoralizing. People don't like it. It conditions them to servitude. It makes them more likely to accept servitude, even if they're more likely to grumble about it. But eventually you stop grumbling too. So, I don't know. It's probably not worth the effort to try to arrive in one's own mind at a solid understanding of who Assange is and, what his social credit score should be.
Yeah. I just to one point, I saw that the Biden administration denied any knowledge of the deal. Like the White House, like they're like, oh, we don't know. This has
Say what? Julian who? What?
I mean,
I think it was just Biden personally denied any knowledge of who Julian Assange is or where he is, or yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like the better part of wisdom to say here that when this mystery is resolved, be it in 50 years or by archaeologists living in an advanced civilization after ours has collapsed into the dust, you won't hear about it first from me. Like, I am definitely not the guy that's going to crack this case. I doubt any of us is. Most interesting to me is sort of the set of allegiances that has emerged as people have aligned on different sides of the pro or anti Assange debate. Like, there is now, I think, a significant contingent on the right that is kind of Assange pilled. And even if they're not falling over for his whole early internet idealism, neo-Solzhenitsyn persona, which feels a little bit trench coat wearing Reddit bro to me. Nevertheless, they've sort of bucketed Assange with Russiagate as like under the heading of your government is lying to you. And therefore, anything that undermines the secrecy of the US government and its ability to keep secrets is good because it hastens the disillusionment, the public's disillusionment in the goodness of the state. And then there's what I would call a more traditional right-wing view, which is that, in fact, Assange is a very different case because the major point at issue here is whether the information he released led to the death or potential harm of U.S. assets, right? I mean, in a narrow sense, this is about, I think, the Espionage Act. And whether you think that's a good law or not, it does certainly like create a special category of information that is not just subject to journalistic kind of freedoms, but actually should be kept secret by the state. And people who reveal those secrets or try to undermine the secrecy of them are actually, enemies of the state in some significant way. So that's the narrow question. But I think the broader question that is raised by those narrow questions is like, should this state and the people who run it be trusted with secrets at all? And I think your inclination on the Assange question will sort of depend on your view of that issue. Like, is the American state at this late stage still to be trusted with secrets? And if it's not, what would the implications of that be? I mean, for my money, like any political managerial class needs to be able to keep secrets. There's like inherently a healthy state does need to keep secrets. But given the extreme moral decay of the people currently occupying those positions, right? Like an Assange can come across as a sympathetic figure to those who feel like those people have totally sinned away their day of grace and, lost any right that they might have had to keep secrets from us because we know that they're hostile to us. We know that they hate us. And even the resolution of this matter involves all sorts of things being kept secret that we feel like we ought to be able to know, as James sort of indicated. So my feeling about Assange is like, I have no time for the guy. I don't have any idea what the murky answers are behind his whole story. Generally, I have a hostility toward people who release like secrets that might get our allies killed or whatever. And Bradley Manning is a whole other story on which don't even get me started. But all of that having been said, I understand why his persona and his story has like kicked up all of these really squicky, uncomfortable feelings about the implications of what people on the right currently think about the state of the US government. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I always come back to this whole thing about Edward Snowden, which it kind of perplexes me. Like, why? Like, there's all these people on the left and the right who seem to think that he's like this great guy, like a hero. Right. Like one time I made some remark on Twitter about Edward Snowden being essentially a Russian asset at this point. I'm not saying
I remember this. Yeah, you got in a big fight with some guy, right?
Well, Glenn Greenwald said I was the stupidest person alive for asserting this. Now, I think he thought I was saying that Edward Snowden had always been a Russian asset. I don't know if he was or not, but clearly the guy he wound up in Russia. He has citizenship there now, or asylum or whatever. Clearly he defected to Russia. I don't know. How is this even like a question?
Well, see, this is what I think I'm saying is that two issues get conflated in these cases. One is, what do you think about this guy and what he did? Yeah. And the other is, what do you think about state secrets and also the moral legitimacy of the US government and the people currently like in power? And I suspect that the conflation between those two things leads people to get very defensive of these individuals who are in themselves really not worth our time of day, right? And I don't know anywhere near enough to say with definitive certainty, whose payroll Edward Snowden is on any more than I know about Julian Assange, but neither of them thrills me with like a delight and a passion of fellow feeling. In fact, I think they both kind of look like rat bags to me, but like the affinity that some people feel for them is so passionate because what they're really passionate about is like these very concerning questions of moral legitimacy, like at a much larger government level.
Right.
Yeah, people don't like being dependent on someone who isn't a hero for finding out something that's really important to like their understanding of what the hell is happening to them and happening to the world. It's just like, it's a letdown, man.
What's interesting to me is that I get the feeling a lot of people on the left and on the right seem to think that the U.S. is very much a totalitarian society in terms of secrecy and information. But as even Noam Chomsky has pointed out, there's no country in the world that's as transparent and free regarding these questions as the United States. No other country has like freedom of information laws where the government has to go to court to defend keeping things secret. I mean, just the fact that Julian Assange was kept in Belmarsh prison for 5 years for no reason. I mean, that couldn't happen in the United States. I mean, it seems like it would be very unlikely that they would be able to keep him there on the basis that, oh, well, another country wants to extradite him and we're just going to keep him there.
Well, I mean, when I hear you raise that Chomsky quote, it makes me think like, hell yeah, right? I mean, if that's true, then I want to like bring out my American flag and beat my chest about our exceptionalism. Like that seems like a good thing. And it does seem like a matter that would make us distinctive internationally. You're making me think of that Walter Kern Matt Taibbi podcast we discussed last week, where he was talking about like these CIA cutouts basically prepping to triage for a stolen election.
Yeah.
And he was saying, if you lived in like, Serbia and you had some local news station that delivered your daily dose of American news, and it was a pretty good station, you would be readily able not only to understand what was going on, but to recognize it as a sort of daily feature of your own life that like the government kind of lies and covers. That like this is sort of par for the course elsewhere. And one thing I think that's going on here is, as exactly as you say, Americans are just not at all used to living under government like that of other countries. And we damn well shouldn't be, and we don't like it. And like that is sort of part of this too.
Yeah, we might be spoiled. I mean, we have a little time, but like, okay, for instance, when you're arrested, you have the right to consult an attorney and you have the right not to say anything. And if you say you want an attorney, the police have to end their interrogation of you until you have an attorney present. And if you don't have to be interrogated. Okay, I found that in Canada, you also have the right to consult with an attorney. Okay, if you say, I want to talk to an attorney, they'll say, okay. They'll put you in touch with an attorney who will say, you're not obligated to say anything. And then you go back in the interrogation room and you sit there with the police for as long as they want. And they're trained to sit there and just hammer at you, asking you questions. And you don't have to respond. They're not going to beat you up, but they're allowed to keep doing it. And you don't get to have an attorney there. And, they know how to make people eventually talk. So it's just interesting to me. Like so many people, liberals typically assume that a place like Canada is just like so much freer than what we have here. Right. I honestly would doubt that any other country is as protective of civil liberties in like situations like that as the United States.
No, that is interesting. And of course, you could make a conservative argument that that's a good thing and a conservative argument that that's a bad thing. And it would reflect sort of which brand of conservatism you espoused. Like tend to list more in the direction of like again, hell yeah. Like
Right.
we are the freest country in the world. We place an extremely high premium on the little guy and therefore on the random citizen, especially these days when you're most likely to hear the word citizen from the FBI, like as in freeze citizen. And like what we see happening in the January 6 cases and all that other stuff does sort of make you feel like, well, you don't really want to get too skeptical of that American sensibility and tradition. On the other hand, again, you could legitimately say, okay, but at a certain point, you do want the cops to be able to do their job, and you don't want to get them so hamstrung and tied up with these Miranda laws and whatever else that they can't, do the dirty business of fighting crime or whatever. And I think that all of these very, I think, legitimate negotiations between conflicting principles are just much easier to manage in a circumstance where people generally kind of feel good about the state of the country, and for the longest time, even debates about this between the right and the left felt like they were contained within a framework of everybody wants the Constitution to be the law of the land. Everybody wants this whole experiment to succeed, and we're just figuring out how to like execute on that in a way that balances competing interests most effectively. I come back though to this shift that happened, I would say, in like the second half of the 20th century, from different people arguing about how to execute on the Constitution to one side continuing to argue about how to execute on the Constitution, with another side that had just decided it didn't want to do the Constitution anymore, or couldn't, or like had moved beyond it or whatever. And then you're in just a completely different ballgame where it might not make any sense anymore to be saying, well, how can we best protect civil liberties, when what you're really arguing over is like, should there be civil liberties at all? And should they extend into the digital domain and into the public health domain and into all these other areas? And perhaps the right has like yet to grasp that in its sort of little internal debates over how this stuff should work.
Yeah. Well, I do have a thought that I could pursue on this, but let's just move on to the next topic. Okay. I think we kind of spent a lot of time on that.
You got to leave them wanting more.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Tuesday was election day in some states, and in New York, the most expensive primary election in U.S. history wound down with Jamal Bowman, he of the hollering in the rotunda and pulling fire alarms and screaming about genocide, lost to George Latimer, sort of a local fixture in Democratic politics. This race was so contentious that it was easy to forget that both of the people were Democrats. I mean, it was a primary election. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, well, groups affiliated with AIPAC, contributed handsomely to the beat Bowman side. And this became a major part of the campaign. Bowman constantly talked about AIPAC money, AIPAC billionaires, people, trying to, people who don't care about the Bronx because a tiny little part of that district is in the Bronx. Billionaires from AIPAC are trying to subvert the will of the people. They're trying to kick a black man out of office. It was all pretty thinly coded, from my perspective at least. And I don't think anybody would really like argue with this, that it was, vaguely anti-Semitic, if not explicitly, as Bowman himself sort of affirmed with some of his other comments. In any case, the question of big money came up a lot. AOC talked about it. Bernie Sanders talked about it. The media talked about it. Now, what I think is kind of funny about this case is that, Democrats used to talk a lot about money in politics. That was like a very common theme. But it's sort of quaint to hear them talk about it now, because like for the last 20 years or so, the Democrats became the big money party. They outspend the Republicans in virtually every national cycle, sometimes by a lot. And they're the ones who have all the billionaires. Anyway, the Bowman-Latimer case struggle is not going away. This is the future of the Democrat Party, I think, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, that this whole Israel-Palestine has become a litmus test. It's become a bright line. It's so funny because Bowman, who attracted all this AIPAC attention because he was so vocal about Gaza, was also being protested by the pro-Palestine side because he supports Joe Biden. So they all think that AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are just like Zionist scum. So it's a very strange case. This purity test. I mean, I guess you could argue this is a feature of leftist movements where you have to go and attack your allies. It's a narcissism of small differences thing. Like you have to purge and execute like people who are deviating slightly. You have to go after them even more fiercely than you would go after your true opponents on the other side ideologically. Anyway, what do you guys think?
Well, it's a real shame because, Bowman, this is a guy, unless I was watching a cheap fake, was putting up like 4 plates at the gym.
He's a monster.
Really, in the best possible sense for once, at least in the gym. And, it sadly goes to show that that posting physique just does not get you all the way in this world.
No.
Alas. Right. Even though it turns out people who work out are more likely to be more conservative, it's not an ironclad rule. It's more of a correlation than a causation, perhaps. In any case, I think this is a really sort of conflict between two strands of leftism that we've been sort of subterraneanly discussing this whole episode. Both of them represent contenders for the passionate, pure ideological vanguard of the Democratic Party and of the American left. One being the old Marxist left, the principled sort of workers of the world unite kind of old left uprising, which, as we've now said a couple times, seems to have become, for the time being at least, entirely domesticated into the structure of American party politics and has become like the moneyed interest of the Democrat Party. And now to hear like Bernie Sanders complaining about all this money that is coming in to fight the grassroots activism represented by Jamal Bowman is laughable, as you say, Seth, because like Bernie Sanders is the moneyed interest basically at this point, or like he's just thoroughly aligned himself with this hugely corporatist behemoth that includes centrist Democrats, but increasingly also includes like whipped Marxists of the old variety. On the other hand, you have the young guns who have stepped confidently into the vacuum left by the old Marxist left to propose a new form of ideological purity, which is this like cultural, not so much workers of the world unite as like minorities of the world unite, or oppressed, wretched of the earth unite, and this is takes some of the same forms structurally as the old working class ideological purity, but crucially, like butters different people's bread, right? Like it selects not just like workers or the working class, but very particular racial demographic groups as the beneficiaries of the coming revolution. Mm-hmm. And it's, to me, like really kind of on the nose that this whole conflict is coming to a head in a dispute between like a black guy and the Jews, which is the central conflict fight over who's going to be the beneficiary of like the uprising of the oppressed, right? And that's like that ancient struggle, which goes back many, many decades in sort of modern American politics, and which literally takes the form of, in some cases, black activist groups proposing to be the real Jews, like just in terms of heritage, not just in terms like this is like, sort of a major feature of radical black activism on the left, is now like becoming actualized in politics with the proposition that sort of Palestinians, brown people, BIPOC, black people, are going to displace Jewish people as the great downtrodden, the great oppressed. And like that is now the central conflict of the Democrat Party. And you're absolutely right. It's not going anywhere. Like it'll probably dominate the convention. It'll certainly dominate the internal struggle on the left for a long, long time. And yeah, I like it, to me, it looks like all the momentum is on the side of kind of the Frantz Fanon wing, the like, Wretched of the Earth Unite side of this, and that the sort of like now establishmentized workers of the world unite people are in retreat and aging out and dying. But like, they still have a lot of institutional power. So it remains to be seen who's going to win this fight.
Well, I would say that they've already displaced the Jews in the realm of like being the most disadvantaged, the most trodden upon. I mean, nobody in America really believes the line that the Jews are like the most like are suffering so much. I mean, that's just kind of like propaganda that's put out, to get people to like not hate them so much. But but I think what they want to displace them from is like all their stuff. I mean, I think that's the idea,
Well, that's like right. Yeah.
I mean, the blacks and the people of color and the BIPOC side of things, they don't see Jews as like different from whites. They just see them as like super whites. Like they have extra privilege and extra resources. It's funny about Jamal Bowman and his tremendous strength. I mean, yeah, he guy's like in his mid 40s or late 40s. He bench presses like 500 pounds. I mean, and I guess he used to play football. But, there's the story of the Golem. I don't know if everybody's familiar with it. Is like the Rabbi of Prague invented this giant clay monster to protect the Jews. And, there's a whole series of events, but effectively it kind of went crazy. And I think of Jamal Bowman as kind of a golem. Like he was sort of, he was elected 4 years ago by the Jews of this district, during 2020 with all the riots and BLM, and Elliot Engel was the predecessor, this kind of, do nothing New York Jewish Democrat who'd just been hanging around for decades. And Bowman, came out, and all the Jews for Jamal and all these very liberal Jews like voted him in, even though he'd already been making like ridiculous comments. So, they created him, and then they have to deal with the monster, kind of like, Frankenstein or something. So they're the ones who had to take him out.
A tale as old as time, really.
A tale as old as time, exactly. But the money thing is ridiculous. Like, in his concession speech, even though he went on the whole campaign about all the billionaires that were, and all the outside money, in fact, most of Latimer's money came from within the district, and 90% of Bowman's money came from outside the district. And in his concession speech, he was thanking the Muslims of Dearborn for everything they did for him. So, whatever. Well, yes, the story continues. Okay, let's move on to our final segment, where we remind you that we're not just a great podcast, but
though we are a great podcast, let's be real.
But we're also a website, and we've got a lot of phenomenal content there. And we encourage our listeners to go to AmericanMind.org and read the damn site. James, why don't you kick us off with your favorite piece of the last week or so?
Well, let's see. It's the 26th of June somehow. I think we did not give any props to John Daniel Davidson's piece from the 20th. Hell is empty and all the bots are here. It is a discussion of artificial intelligence and paganism, which would only make sense if you were to know that he is the author of a book called Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come, of which this piece is an excerpt. Watch this space on the right for continuing controversy and debate over exactly what we should make of so-called artificial intelligence, and specifically whether it is in and of itself some kind of demonic force, or whether it is perhaps just a very powerful lamp, something that draws energy and emits some kind of product that people seem to want really bad. It's a good place to start if you are either just kind of unsure how to think about it all, or have opinions of your own and want to see how they hold up under scrutiny. So the piece is Hell is Empty and All the Bots Are Here. The author, John Daniel Davidson.
Yeah, that was a super piece, and it actually made me want to read the book, which book excerpts don't always do.
Sometimes they do the opposite.
Too true, right?
Which is also a service.
Yeah, absolutely. Much like reviews.
Yeah. Spencer, what did you like this week?
Okay, I'm going a tiny bit rogue in recommending two pieces, but they go together, I promise, and I'll be quick. This feature about art continues to generate really fascinating content that I am watching with great interest. I'm gonna sort of respond to all of it once some of the entries have started to peter out, but for now it rages on strong. And I think listeners would particularly benefit from reading two pieces back to back. One is called Politics is Now Not Downstream from Culture. It's by Isaac Simpson. And one of them is a reprint from Mary Harrington's Substack. It's called TV is Always Progressive. And the reason I think these are useful to read together is because Isaac, who's a very canny writer of copy, among other things, makes the case that conservatives just ought to be making art that sells. Stop theorizing about whether your art is conservative and start making art that actually plays in the market, because that'll be a better guide to what moves people. And Harrington, unrelated, not responding to Isaac, but responding to me, says, stop caring about TV and movies so much, Spencer and others, because there are structural reasons why mass market media of that kind are inherently progressive as a form. Harrington and Isaac are both just excellent and incisive writers. And for somebody like me, who I would define myself as a sort of qualified poptimist, that is, I've always loved pop culture and mass media, but also understood the major challenges that they pose and the ways that they tend to deteriorate. These are really interesting pieces to consider back to back. Certainly the evidence is on Mary's side in terms of the current state of pop culture. And one of the things I'm going to be thinking about going forward is whether she's right that this is a structural feature, not a bug. And thoughts like this is why I've been unconscionably and I think maybe even a little bit too nasty about Star Wars on Twitter lately. But that's a story for another day. Seth, back to you.
Yeah, those were both great pieces. I particularly enjoyed Isaac Simpson. Am I getting his name right? Yeah. His piece was great. It was really fun. And Mary's piece also. I'm going to suggest that people take a look at a piece we published this week by Todd Bensman called Biden's Escalating Border Crisis. And, this piece came out right in the middle of all this more news about Tajiks, people from Tajikistan, related to ISIS-K. Like, you thought ISIS was gone, but there's a new version. And they're pouring across the southern border. Supposedly, according to Todd, in the last 14 years, they had, stopped a couple dozen people from Tajikistan. And in the last 2 years, they've stopped and released 2,500. The piece just goes through, what a disaster this is. He points out that a number of Tajiks in Germany were arrested plotting to attack NATO facilities and U.S. bases. It seems almost like a certainty that these guys are here to. I mean, the FBI arrested a bunch of them for this. That there are cells here now of ISIS militants who are here specifically for the purpose of killing us. So, what do you know? When you open up a border, bad guys come in. So, yeah, it's a good piece. Todd Bensman, Biden's escalating border crisis. Excellent piece. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this week. If you want to know more about the work we do, you can go to AmericanMind.org. If you'd like to support our work, you can click the support tab at the top of the page. We appreciate the donations that fund our work greatly. You can leave a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can subscribe to the podcast and spread the good news by tweeting about us, telling your friends, posting our items on social media. Just bring it up at your Independence Day barbecue. We appreciate all the support we get. And it's thanks to you and because of you that we do what we do. Thanks to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to everybody listening. Until next week, signing off.